Stop! You've been lied to about communication. You've been told that simple non-verbal tricks can make you feel more confident or more persuasive. But guess what? They actually don't work. Why? Because they ignore the real science of psychology. But don't worry, we've got you covered. Welcome to Mastering Momentum with An Gaiser and Dr. Abbie Maroño. We are going to break down the truth about self-awareness, influence and impact based on science that actually works.
So having someone who understands it in a really deep way, explain it, or go to the research papers yourself if that is something that you like to do, is a much better way than going to TikTok or quick learning.
I am An Gaiser, a forensic behavioral expert and a specialist in investigative interviewer. With over 20 years of experience, including the probation and secret services. Together with Dr. Abbie, one of our world's leading experts in behavioral analysis, we are here to change the way you see communication forever. If you are ready to level up understanding of nonverbal behavior, psychology and influence, hit play on our latest episode now. Available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts and YouTube. Subscribe now. Well, Abbie, we already started talking about our gym work and our fitness and how we stay fit as women. But this is not the conversation we are going to have today, right?
Hopefully not. I mean, I'm up for anything, but hopefully not.
Yeah. Well, like said on Instagram already, I finally have you all by myself. Because I think we met, in 22, right? At the behavioral analysis conference.
I think we had connected virtually beforehand, but I think we officially met in person when I was a professor at Northampton. So must have been 22.
Yeah, it's been a while. And after that, also the conference with 𝗀𝗵𝗶𝗀, where you unfortunately had to do it online.
Yeah. What was it? 23, 24?
I think a year later, yeah, for
23.
sure. Yeah. And maybe you have been to one of the conferences because, and it was also in Amsterdam, right? So maybe
I think that was 22 as well because I was still in the UK at that point.
Yeah, that was great as well. We are also going to talk about our experiences, I guess, with both our mentor. We have a lot in common.
Yes.
Considering both our backgrounds, I really love to chat with you about that. And also about our common interest in nonverbal communications and also in relation to investigative interviewing. Because I think we both can experience that there are a lot of myths and a lot of misconceptions about how to really do a good interview. And also because I find it very important to reflect as well, what are the critiques we both can encounter when it comes to saying that you are a nonverbal behavioral expert. I really like to dive into all of that. So let's see where that takes us.
Absolutely.
So where would you like to start?
I don't mind.
Well, maybe just start with, because our my Dutch colleagues and the Dutchies here in the Netherlands don't know you very well yet. Maybe this is going to help to show a little bit more about your work. So maybe just introduce yourself. Who are you and what do you do?
So I'm Dr. Abbie Maroño. My background is in psychology. I have a PhD in psychology specialized in nonverbal communication and behavioral analysis. So my work originally focused on nonverbal communication in social psychology. And everything was focused around forensic psych and social psych. And I have a pretty interesting research background. There's a lot of research into serial killers and cannibalism and all the dark stuff. And that was really where I began in that forensic field. And I specialized then in information elicitation, again, very forensic focused. And I became a professor of psychology. And I used to make fun of positive psych. and be like, oh, you guys, full of flowers, while I'm over here submitting my really dark ethics applications. And then something changed. I don't know what it was that made me push in the direction of positive psych, but I remember having a conversation with Joe one day, Joe Navarro, and I said to him that academia just wasn't living up to my expectations. I'd always wanted to be a professor, and I didn't feel that I was contributing in the way that I wanted to. And it was almost like the students didn't want to be there. And it was like they were learning for the sake of learning. And I said, I just don't feel challenged in the way that I want to. And I don't feel like the information I'm giving is being received in the way that I want it to. I'm so passionate about what I do. I wanted to be surrounded by people that were just so hungry for it. And even though that was academia, something didn't quite fit. And it took me a little bit of time to realize why. And what it was is my motto is making science accessible. And I see so many people outside of science desperate to understand the science, but it isn't accessible. And when I was in academia, I just felt like another cog in the machine. And I was giving science to people that understood science. And when I started to step out and go into business, went into the private sector, I felt like I was making more of a difference. And I kind of dropped the dark psychology and moved more into positive psychology. Instead of looking at, cannibalism and serial killers, I moved into how can I create cooperation and trust. And as I started giving that to people in the industry, I realized how much difference I was making, because these were people that didn't think that they could understand science and didn't think that science was even interesting, And when I do speeches, I have people that say, I didn't think this was for me, but now I feel interested enough to go and pursue it. So that's where I felt like I was making my difference. So I moved away from the dark stuff. And I have an interesting clash, I guess, of the stuff that I do, because I'm in information security. So I do security, deception detection, nonverbals. But then I also do trauma recovery, emotional regulation, and shame, and things in that field. And for me, I had always focused on academia in terms of this is who I am. And when I did my PhD, I just focused on studying. And I kind of forgot to leave room for the fact that I'm also a human being that goes through human experiences. Yeah. And everything I did was I just need to get to this next academic achievement. And I had gone through some pretty severe traumas in my early life. And then later in life, I had experienced sexual assault. And it shook my world in a way that I can't put into words. And I was behaving in ways I didn't understand, and I was lost and broken, and it was affecting every aspect of my life. And I was seeking the science. So I was looking at popular psychology books, because at this time I was still in dark psych. So I was desperate for something to help me, because I wanted to get better. But these popular science books weren't working, because they would promote these notions that were really appealing, but they didn't actually follow how human beings work. So I kind of took it upon myself and said, okay, scrap that. Let me look in the literature. As a scientist, I understand how to comprehend these kinds of papers. So I considered myself a data point and looked in the academic literature. And it was through that learning that I moved outside of dark psych into positive psych. And I got myself from really the brink of suicide to the happiest I've ever been in a couple of years. And that's really what pushed this, making science accessible, because I realized there is some incredible researchers out there, and just thousands of researchers doing incredible work that isn't getting recognized in the public sphere, because it isn't always accessible for so many reasons, including things like paywalls and terminology. And what I decided to dedicate my career now to is obviously doing the same with the security side, but also with the trauma recovery and emotional regulation, taking that science and putting it into forms that's accessible to everyone, and not fluffing it up to sell it, to make money and sell like these empty promises and snake oil, keeping the integrity of the science, but just making it comprehensible and making it understandable in any format. I publish books now in blog format, podcasts, any way that I can that the lay person can understand. Because often you read a book and it's almost like the author's trying to prove to you how smart they are. You know, look at all these things I know. And you hear that on podcasts sometimes, the terminology is fluffed up. So it's like, look how smart I am. Look at all these things I know. That doesn't help the listener. It doesn't help the reader. Make it as simple as possible whilst maintaining the scientific integrity. And that is how I consider my career now. Every single thing I do is just dedicated to making science accessible, and science in the format of psychology in every way that I can.
Yeah. Well, it's good to hear. And me, as started as a practitioner, I found it so very important that I was able to argument how I felt in my interviews. I myself started at the probation service. Let's talk about dark psychology. I saw it all the whole DSM-5, the Diagnostical Statistical Manual. I saw it all. And also from a personal point, as I told you before, I was also had an unstable background because of parents. My mother with borderline personality psychosis. So it sounds very, very familiar to me, hearing that, wanting to understand what is really going on in humans. First, for my own personality, am I at risk myself of becoming ill, for instance? But also, how does it work? And that really got me started at the probation service. But for me, the academia world wasn't accessible because of my background. And let's talk about your book later. But when you talk about imposter syndrome, for instance, for me it was, I have to push myself because I have to find a way to make that knowledge for me personal accessible, because I have to write to court as well. I have to make a diagnosis and a plan of how I would help my my clients at the probation service. So for me it was very hard and difficult to access to that information as well. And there are not enough people, I think, who have the same mentality or the same vision in why science is actually there. It is to put it in practice, right? And I found myself during that time, when I asked questions to academics, that it was very hard to get the answers.
I myself have found that when I was a professor. I remember having a conversation with a colleague who was in a very different field than me. And I wanted to understand some of his research. And this was early in my career as an academic, and I was really interested in evolutionary psychiatry. So I'd started reading a lot of books, obviously started with Richard Dawkins. And I had come up with some theories, and I had brought them to him because he was an expert in evolutionary psych. And I said, this is what I'm thinking. And he looked at me with disgust and was like, that's not how it works. And was very patronizing. And I had found this a few times, of when you would bring ideas, it felt like you were talked down to for not knowing as much as that other professor. And it's like, well, of course I don't, because this is what you've spent 10 years doing. So I'm coming to you to learn. And I did feel that in academia, although there was some amazing research being done and some amazing professionals, I did feel like there was this battle of everyone's trying to prove that they're the smartest. And it shouldn't be about being the smartest. It should be about contributing to the literature in a meaningful way. But then when I left academia and moved into being a practitioner, it felt like there was a battle going on between both sides. Academics are like, we're the smart ones, and you guys are stupid because you don't understand the complexities. And then practitioners are like, well, you're stupid because those complexities aren't practical in the real world. And it's like they would use different terminology and butt heads. And there's got to be a balance of keeping the complexities and that integrity, but making it accessible and making it usable, because human behavior is so complicated that if we take the understandings from science and implement them in their entirety into practice, we'd never get anything done because it is so complicated. So we have to simplify it in a meaningful way so we can use it. But there is a tendency for practitioners to oversimplify things. For example, with nonverbal behavior, taking one behavior every time it's shown in me, every time it's shown, it means this one thing. That's just not how it works. Or even in psychology, every time I see this, it always means this. Nothing always means something with every single person because people are complicated. So there's got to be a balance between, like I said, that integrity, but also making it practical. I just found it very difficult for those conversations to be had because there was just a lot of fighting. And interestingly, in the literature, there's a lot of papers published on how to communicate between practice and academia because there is so much arguing going on. And it's nice to see that I think this is slowly reducing and there are people kind of sitting as the bridge between both sides. And this is where I found that I was happiest. I always thought that I was, I'm always going to be an academic at heart. I love science. But my passion is giving science to those who wouldn't normally have it. Because, like I said, students, they have so much access to it. But being able to translate it in a way that people who wouldn't otherwise have access can realize how fun and exciting psychology is and how much it brings to your profession, no matter what the profession is, and to your self-development too. There's so much love there for me.
And do you think there might be a culture difference in maybe in the USA, for instance, that the gap is closing a little bit more? Because here in Europe or in the Netherlands, I still get a lot of resistance from the academia as well.
Well, I have found that academics can be quite mean.
I know, I've experienced
they can be mean. And as an academic, I have been insulted so many times simply for asking questions about someone's research and again talked down to, and it can be really disheartening because you're asking information to seek more knowledge to learn. And I have found actually in America academics are meaner, and it's something that when I speak to other academics who have left academia and now work in the private sector, a lot of the time, the reason that they have left is I found the community very toxic. Now, what I do want to say is that I don't think a lot of it is necessarily the academics' fault. I think the system of academia puts so much pressure on academics. As a professor, you are underpaid, you are overworked, and that passion you have to get you into academia, to love science, to educate, can be really diminished because what I found was I was asked to create lectures for my students. And what you want to do as a professor is create the best, most intense, exciting lessons, but you're not given enough time. You're not given enough resources. So you do the best that you can with what you're given and you're already overworked. So you're not really able to cherish and make that love flourish because you're so stressed. So I do think a lot of that is not the academics' fault. I think they're put under so much pressure that it's inevitable that there's going to be toxicity in academia. So I think it needs to come kind of from higher up.
It seems like it's almost the same like in politics or in the corporate world, right? Where the hierarchy is almost the same. And when you see it, I've seen it also with where I worked before with the Institute of Nonverbal Strategy Analysis, which is now a foundation. They did scientific research and published, like I've sent you as well, about the meaning of the nonverbal personal repertoire. And 𝗏𝗏𝗏 has encountered so many resistance also from the academia world, because on one side you have all those psychology experts, you have the nonverbal experts who say this is completely different from what we know about nonverbal communication. And the other side, well, this is not how the brain works. This is not how psychology works. How can you say, based on a 10-minute analysis, that these are the interaction needs based on the nonverbals alone? So he was way ahead, but people didn't want to hear it. And he had to review over and over and over. And so it was very hard for him as well, especially also the academics who work in, for instance, government institutes like the police as well. They also still show a lot of resistance against new methods that are tested, but also new ideas, new questions, like you say as well. So I think there's also a hierarchy problem in there.
Yeah, and I think one of the issues too is science is constantly developing. So scientists are very aware that they might have a certain study or a certain concept, but they're not married to this concept because they know it will change. That is a really difficult thing for practitioners to put into work, because you have a concept, so you create a framework and you implement this into your systems. Okay, now we have it running. It took us 3 years to get this system functioning optimally. And now the science changes. And that's what science does. We learn more. You know, we think we know something. We go, yes, okay, we do study after study and we prove it. And then a research paper comes out and goes, oh, this is something that we missed. Or a new element has come in. Or society slightly changes, because society changes and fluctuates, meaning that concepts in psychology fluctuate and change. But now we take this to practice, and practitioners are like, well, I've just spent years developing this system. No way am I going to change it. So they see it. They maintain that system for 10 years because it works. So there's a lot of mismatch there, because now science is like, well, this is so outdated. And then practice is like, yeah, but it's not easy for us to implement these new changes. So I'm just going to stick to what we know.
Yeah.
And this is what we really want to avoid doing. And there's got to be a lesson in practice of science will change. And if you really want to run the most successful business that you can, you have got to be willing to change with the science. And as a scientist too, you've got to not be married to your research. There are research papers that I have published that at the time I thought I developed this beautiful new thing. And I'm like, oh, it's amazing. It's novel. A few years later, I'm like, I made an oopsie.
Yeah.
And now, you know, I know something slightly different, but that's science.
Yeah.
It's like in the field of nonverbal communication, there are researchers who are still married to this idea of microexpressions and will not let them go. We know it is not effective. It is not supported in the literature. It has not been for a very long time. It is so heavily and robustly contradicted. But people don't want to let it go because there's a lot of money from creative training courses of looking at microexpressions. And there's so many papers. Look at my research background. And they go, okay, I have all these papers in it. If I now accept maybe it's not quite what I thought that it was, does this diminish all of my research papers? No. That's the process of science. You have got to remove ego.
Yeah.
I remember when I was in my 𝗪𝗏, which is the assessment prior to getting awarded my PhD. And I had done a couple of studies. And in one of my studies, I had made a really stupid mistake. And the paper would have been wonderful because I was like, I proved this really cool thing. And then the following study, I corrected the mistakes that I made and undid the work that I proved and said, I didn't actually show this new thing that's really exciting. But here's the reality. And I remember in my 𝗪𝗏, one of my examiners had said to me, one of the main reasons that they loved my thesis was because they could see my learning journey as a scientist. And that's what you should be aiming. It's not about let me produce the most incredible research that's going to break the world. It's about, can I have integrity and critical thinking as a scientist? And he said, you observed your mistakes and you corrected them.
Yeah,
and it meant that your research was less exciting but you corrected them. And that's what you should be doing. It's not about proving yourself right. It's actually about proving yourself wrong.
Yeah.
Did I make a mistake? What can I do better? That's what science is.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the mismatch comes in between science and practice. And it's understandable, but you've got to leave your ego at the door.
Yeah. Yeah.
You've got to leave your ego at the door, and you're going to have to be ready to make changes and get comfortable with that.
I always make the joke myself now as a commercial company that this problem of letting go of your ego is actually not filling my bank account.
Yeah, that's the thing, right?
Yeah, that's the thing. And I see constantly, especially still in the Netherlands, that a lot of companies are still using the micro-expressions, and they sell very well still. They're still selling lie detection. And it's very hard to see for me, because what I always say, everything that comes by, your literature, Joe, who's given me a lot of good reflections and critique as well, and I have to rephrase what I'm doing and what I'm telling people. And it can be very hard first, because how do you make it accessible for the people I teach myself? So what I constantly do is I try to read the literature as well, and then test it in practice. Even when I'm a role player still at one of the government services, where it's safe to test things out. Does this work, yes or no? And then reflect and constantly take in the feedback. Other people say, no, this is not what I'm feeling. This is not what I'm actually want to express. And that really helps. Because it can make, it's hard because it costs a lot of time. And that's why it's not filling my bank account yet.
Yeah.
But I want to do it differently. I want to stay integer. I want to keep my ego in check. And that's very hard, especially as a commercial company.
Yeah. And it's easy to see what people want, right? Because people want easy to implement. They want simple. That sells. If I say, do this, you'll get this result. And if I say, here's 5 tips, you do them, win every time. Gosh, I can make a lot of money. But that's not how it works. And what people that don't have integrity will do is see what people want to hear, and they will find a way to sell them that. And they will utilize all the outdated research and arguments and simplifications. And I see so much evolutionary psych very badly used as explanations, where it's very misunderstood. They utilize ultimate causations and ignore proximal. So they give kind of half an evolutionary explanation. And what it does is it makes it seem really good. And these are the same ones they use big terminology. Look how smart I am. Look how much I know. Right, of course. And as a practitioner, if you're not reading the research, and to be honest, it's so hard to keep up with the research. It's a full-time job.
Yeah.
So you want something that sounds good and looks good. So you utilize that, and you'll pay a lot of money because you're promised these big results. And for someone to come in and say, actually, it's a lot more complicated than that, I'm going to charge money and you won't get as great results. I don't want that. I want this guy that's promising all these big results. But you need to recognize that if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And what I'm saying about it's a full-time job to read the research, we need to also realize that we can't do it all. If you are a practitioner, for you to be able to be an expert practitioner, you can't keep up with the science. It is too much work. You cannot do it all by yourself. And what I noticed is when I moved into the private sector, I had this flourishing array of science knowledge, and I was so excited to implement it. And even though the knowledge itself and the theories were robust, they didn't work in practice because they were too complicated and it wasn't able to fit. So the practitioners said, I get that this is how it works, but it's just not merging in a way that we can utilize it. So the practitioners then give you feedback and you go, okay, well, how can I make this easier for you? So there's got to be that synergy. And for me as a scientist, working with practitioners makes me a better scientist. As a practitioner, working with scientists will make you a better practitioner. But you can't do it all. If I wanted to be an expert practitioner, I would lose my ability to be an expert scientist because I wouldn't have the time to maintain them both.
Yeah.
So you've got to try and work together to find that balance.
Yeah, so that might be one tip, right? If we talk about tips, how
Actually,
to work together.
yeah, when I go to information security conferences and I work with organizations and they're implementing security systems, they're doing interviewing, things like that. And I say, okay, where are your behavioral scientists? And they go, what do you mean? And I go, where on your team do you have an expert science advisor? And they go, oh, well, we have expert practitioners, we have this. And I go, okay, but who is teaching your team the science? And there's always kind of a break of, oh, we never really thought that we needed one.
Yeah.
You always need a scientist in your team. If you are a sales company, where's your behavioral scientists who understand human thinking and human decision-making? If you're a marketing company, where are your scientists? If you are a security company, where are your scientists? All of these industries that you don't think you need someone with that academic knowledge, you do.
Mm-hmm.
Same with if you are an academic, collaborate with people in the field because they know what it's like in practice. They know the hurdles you're going to overcome. And we get so trapped in these little bubbles that we forget to kind of reach out. But one of the biggest things I advise major organizations and CEOs when I train them is you can't do it all. You really can't. You have to have good advisors on your team. And I work with Virtual Sapiens, which is kind of like an AI virtual nonverbal training. And 𝗁𝗂, who is the CEO, why I love working with her is she is so smart. She is wonderful, but she recognizes her limitations. She says, I'm a businesswoman.
Yeah.
I need scientists to advise me how to be a better businesswoman. So
I have exactly the other problem, right? I am too much into practice, but also wanting to understand makes it very hard still to find a balance, right? Because I want to keep up with everything. I want to tell the right story where there is one truth. Okay, probably not. But for me, it's very important when I teach investigative interviewers or when I teach CEOs, for instance, it's all about helping them to understand that you have to think in certain scenarios. What is out there? There is micro-expressions, okay, but what if I'm actually looking at someone? What else might there be? When we talk about the 𝗀𝗃 method, it might also be that frowning and squinting might mean that someone is trying to get a grip or control of the situation, is very analytical and very focused. So how do you use your conversational skills to find which one of the scenarios is actually true? But then I'm still very busy on working on the theories, working on the practice. So if you think about that, and especially for small businesses or investigative interviewers who work at a company, what would you advise them to filter out certain literature, but also be able to still teach in the right way?
I think having a trusted board of advisors is absolutely one of the most important things for businesses. You need to have trusted scientists. Or say you work in the clinical field, have trusted psychologists. If you work in the forensic field, have people who are experts in forensic psych. Have these individuals on your team that you trust, that are not going to sell you snake oil. Because again, you can't do it all. Keeping up to date with the literature and producing your own research is extremely time consuming. So you need someone who has that understanding, who is able to advise and translate it so that you can do the best job as a professional. So having that board of advisors is so important.
Yeah. That's also what I talk about with our mentor, Joe Navarro, right? To also criticize your own thinking and reflect on things. And this is what we know, but you shouldn't read my books. You should read Desmond Morris. And then I'm going in the rabbit hole as well.
Yep, having good mentors and good advisors is so important. I would not be where I am today without my mentors. People that have given me a chance, people that have stopped me making mistakes that they have made that cost them years of work. And just simple advice like that of don't take this route because this could happen, or maybe try this thing. These things are so essential. And like I said, I have worked really, really hard to be where I am. but having good advisors and mentors has opened doors that without them, I wouldn't have been able to open.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was also reflecting based on your experience, because we can still say you are pretty young for what you have achieved already. And you working very hard as well. I'm 44 now, and I even from a practitioner perspective, I sometimes get discredited for knowing so much. How can you know all of this? That this knowledge cannot be in one person. How do you do that? And I recognize from what you wrote in your book and what you say on other podcasts as well, you have to sacrifice a lot.
Yeah.
But people, when the academics or other people who are doubting your knowledge, they are not in the same situation. They did not all those sacrifices. And I was thinking, what goes on in your mind if you maybe even get the same critique, or when you are discredited that way? What do you say to those people?
So it used to happen when I was a PhD student and I would do events. Since obtaining my PhD, it hasn't occurred. I can see when I enter and people are shocked because it's not what they expect. When I'm training, for example, when I train Secret Service and I come in and they're looking for like, where's the adult? And I'm like, it's me. I'm Dr. Abbie. But the thing is, I was taught, don't convince, convey.
Yeah.
And I work really hard and I produce a lot of research papers. And what I remind myself is my research speaks for itself. My output speaks for itself. And I am always willing to be critiqued. If you know something that you think I need to know, tell me. If you think I'm doing something wrong, tell me. I am not ever tied to my knowledge because I understand the more you know, the less you know. So if I'm ever critiqued, I want to understand where that critique comes from. If it comes from where you're too young to do this, I remind people that, well, I started very young. I started publishing in the field when I was 19.
Yeah.
So I had a very, very good head start in the field. And I had my head down and I was focused. And I have been deemed by the US government as top 1% in my field based on my output. I've won awards for my scientific output. I have, like I said, published papers. I've been recognized. So I'm confident in my ability. So I no longer feel offended if people don't want my science or take my advice, because it's like, okay, well, I don't have a personal investment in that. I stand by my integrity. And again, what you said about sacrifice is the way that I've gotten to where I am so young is since 17 years old, it's all I've done. I haven't invested in personal relationships. I've been single for 7, 8 years because I haven't had the time. I've worked weekends, I've worked evenings, I've worked mornings. I haven't taken holidays since about 17. You know, there are very few holidays, very few anything that I have done other than work. Now, that isn't sustainable for most people. And that is a miserable life to most people. But me, I love it so much because I love what I do. So that sacrifice of time, if you think about the amount of hours I've put into my craft, it's probably the same amount of hours as someone much younger would have put into their craft. And that just is what it is. And like I said, I'm not married to my knowledge. If I'm shown new information, I'm so willing to update my knowledge and criticize myself and develop and grow. And I call it taking the long road of, I don't sell snake oil. And maybe because I work this way, I won't get certain opportunities, but that's fine because my output speaks for itself. And eventually people will recognize. And what you said about people criticizing and not wanting to take you seriously, I did find that at the beginning, but then I consistently show integrity and I consistently put out research and I consistently do good work. And then people start to recognize. So now I no longer really come across that issue.
Yeah, and then for me, maybe on a in a smaller way, but it's also as a practitioner the impact you can make on teams or groups. Because I've seen a lot in the probation service, I've seen a lot at the secret service. Not narcissists can make me go crazy in a conversation because I can see through it and I'm able to not be offended by those people, and I can actually say this is not going to work for me because I can see right through it. I've seen hundreds of people like that. So I started to reflect on, okay, maybe I am offended. The first time I got a rapist before me was very hard as well. We talked about our own personal experience, and I was sexually offended at the age of 16. And the first time at the probation service when I had to deal with a rapist was very hard to me, where he said, well, girl, you are not going to tell me anything. Go back to school and give me someone else to deal with. And I had 2 years with this guy because I had to let him go to therapy. I had to do some kind of behavioral change. So for me, it was actually hard. How am I going to do this? And my ego was like, then it's not going to work. So I had to reflect upon, okay, how am I going to reach this guy? Because there is 2 more years to go. So I had to change my own behavior first before I was able to guide him through those 2 years and to understand those kinds of behaviors, not to be offended as well. And once you do that years and years and years, then you can really make a change, make an impact, maybe not for the narcissist himself, but for the community around him. And people start to trust themselves a little bit more and how to communicate with people like this. So this is actually the impact that really helped me overcome the critique. And for instance, when government agency says, well, you are not the academic, you should not be or in an interrogation or whatever, talking to a source of a secret service, that's not a good idea. And now I can say, well, bring it on. Because I have done thousands of interviews and conversations and I'm not offended anymore. My ego is not struck every time someone else shows his authority, for instance. So I think we have our different way, no matter if you are an academic or a practitioner. Once you get the experience in, it will make you better as well. But you have to be able to reflect.
Yeah, and that's why self-development is so important. And when people say to me, how do you do so much of this? I say, well, this is why I advise to learn psychology for everyone, because psychology gives you an unfair advantage. People say, how are you so productive? But I also understand the psychology of human decision-making. I study the psychology of productivity. If I want my emotions to not get in my way, I study the science of emotional regulation. And then I teach that. So everything I teach, I'm learning about myself as I do it. So psychology gives you this almost like a superpower. That's how it feels of, well, how do I get in more hours and how do I do more work? Well, psychology can tell you. How do I function more optimally? Psychology can tell me. And that's why I work out the way that I do. That's why I eat the way that I do. That's why my routines are the way that I do. I have structured my life based on the teachings of science in order to make me a better teacher of science. So no matter what you do, if you understand psychology and you dive into the psychology of personal development and self-development, it will help you be better at whatever you're doing, because we all have personal boundaries. Personal hurdles that we have to overcome, personal limitations, professional limitations. And if you don't understand those, you're going to keep hitting them without realizing. So if you're like, okay, I want to be more productive, wouldn't a great place to start be, okay, well, what is getting in my way? And let me understand where I'm getting in my way. And if you think, oh, I'm not feeling good, say you've got a headache most days, or you're struggling with motivation, these things, well, the literature can help you understand how to improve it. And that's actually one of the reasons I moved out of being such a binary researcher in terms of the field. So I'm no longer a social researcher. I'm no longer forensics. My field is biopsychosocial. So I take a little bit of biology and I make sure I incorporate that. And then I look at sociology and I incorporate that. Then I look at social psych and biopsych and physiology. And I try and incorporate those understandings because I remember my supervisor, 𝗬cie, when I was doing my PhD, I was reading so many books on nonverbals and social psych, and she said to me, don't be such an expert in your field that you lose your expertise.
Exactly.
What do you mean? And she was like, so focused on one specific area that you're missing the nuances of human behavior. So learn a little bit about social psych and learn all these other things, because then you realize you pull them together. And I'm releasing a book in June called The Upper Hand, and it's my own influence framework. And that only exists because I stepped away from being a binary researcher and I looked at multi-disciplines and became multidisciplinary researcher. And I realized understanding biology and even understanding a bit of physics and all these things and neuroscience, and you don't have to be so perfectly understood in all of these areas because I can't know everything about all these fields, but diving in and pulling understandings from all of them, it makes you a more well-rounded researcher. And my framework wouldn't have occurred if I hadn't taken that knowledge of move outside your field and learn around the outside, because I bet you there's some insights there. And that's what I found. Like I said, a lot of that is start with personal development. Emotional regulation is the best skill to learn.
Yeah, reflecting on that, Abbie, it also reflects me on how I did my work at the Secret Service, vetting for people who had to deal with state secrets, for instance, and really going into a topic, because I was vetting all kinds of roles at that time. And I really had to study the topic before I had to talk with someone. For instance, when I had to screen someone for the NATO, I had to understand, how is it for you to be an ambassador? What can you encounter when it comes to integrity issues, when it comes to being honeypotted, for instance, or when it comes to are you able to say something if someone else is going to push the button for a nuclear bomb or whatever? And suddenly I found myself in the rabbit hole of how does the nuclear world work? At that time, you really wanted to know the vulnerabilities of someone, being able to have a good conversation with someone, being able to give feedback and critique about how they live, using certain interview techniques like Socrates dialogue, for instance, to ask the difficult questions. What would you do if? Have you considered this or that, etc., to make it a collaboration? But you can only do that as an investigative interviewer if you research all the information you need to know. So that's where also my private time went quite often, because it's very interesting, but you have to let it go. Like you said, you are not an expert on that specific topic. You are an expert in eliciting information to get the best out of it.
And I think what strikes me with what you just said is it's so clear that if you do want to be the best you can be in whatever field it is, there is one undeniable. It's hard work.
And
it's consistent hard work. And a lot of people are looking for really easy fixes. And there just is no easy answer. And when people say, what's the secret to getting where you are so young? A lot of hours, a lot of time, a lot of dedication. And when I really want to not be in my office, if I physically can be, I will be. And that doesn't mean pushing myself to the point of burnout, of course. But I push myself to my limits. And then I recognize, okay, now I need my break. And then I go have my break so I can come back. But at the end of the day, there is no alternative for hard work. Because if you go into a meeting, say you're going into a meeting with someone who's from a culture you've never associated with before, you could go into that meeting and just prepare your notes and your negotiation style. Or you could go the extra mile, which means more time to research that culture, research their traditions, research what does work and doesn't work for them. Now, that's a lot of additional work, but it's going to make your negotiation more successful. But that concept translates to everything you do. Marketing, analysis, anything you do. If you take that extra time to put in a bit of extra work, you're going to have an effect. So if you have those advisors and other people doing a lot of that work for you and being able to give you quicker advice as well as reading yourself, you're going to be the most efficient that you can be.
Yeah. I was also thinking, because I also teach a lot of internal auditors, because most of the time they are trying to get their facts, trying to research all the processes there are in the company, and then they have to give back their findings to report to higher levels or director or team lead or whatever. And they also encounter the problem, but I don't have the time to do all of that. I have 45 minutes to have this interview, to do this conversation. I don't have time to research first. Second, I don't have time to use 20 minutes to build rapport or connection. And then my first question would be, okay, what are you doing that you need 20 minutes to build a connection? Because you can do it faster if you know the science and if you know yourself and if you know your own impact. But also, it takes a lot of time if you do not do it right, because people, you might lose the connection, you might lose the rapport. If you give the findings in a way that people don't accept those findings, it might be because you didn't do the work beforehand. So what is actually the time you are spending and where are you spending it?
Yes.
And that's very hard for people to understand, especially when they work very rational. And I'm also thinking, but behavior is irrational. So why are you still taking a rational approach to something that is irrational?
Are you ready to elevate your communication skills and truly understand the power of nonverbal behavior? I am An Gaiser, a specialist in behavioral analysis and investigative interviewing. At An Gaiser Consultancy, we offer tailored training sessions designed to enhance your nonverbal intelligence and conversation skills. So whether you are looking to boost your personal impact or improve your team dynamics, our programs provide practical, science-based strategies to help you succeed. Visit 𝗀𝗏𝗏𝗏.com to discover how we can support your journey to more effective communication.
Yeah, that's the thing. We say, oh, well, I don't have the time now. And it's like, okay, but you're going to lose the time later. And they say, when I get told, I don't have the time, so I'm going to just do it this way. And it's because they want a successful result. I say, well, find the time because you're going to lose it. Otherwise, you might think you're saving yourself time doing this, but you're actually doing is you're taking that time from future you. Or you're just going to waste it because you're not going to get the client. Sometimes things work out and you get lucky. And then often they use that as, oh, well, this is what worked for me before, so I'm going to do it again. What I always say to CEOs is, okay, great, you make good money. Great, you have effective results. Don't you want them to be better? Don't you want to make more? Because you don't know what hurdles you're overcoming unless you understand the science. So, you can do great work, but you could do better. You could be more efficient. You could be more productive. You could be more motivated. And all of that comes with that development. And it's up to you whether you want to put the hard work in or not. And if you don't, then fine. But somebody else will.
Yeah.
And that's what I teach, because it is hard to be at the top. And it is hard to be the most effective because you have to put in so much work. So you have to decide what you're willing to sacrifice. There's a quote that I love, and it says, if you don't sacrifice for what you want becomes a sacrifice. And that is consistent for everything.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that you have to, reduce everything else and only give to your career. You don't have to do that to the extremes, but somebody will. So you've got to understand that there's got to be a sacrifice and figure out how much time you're willing to put in and how much time you're not willing to put in.
I think that's a good lesson for all practitioners as well, for sure. And I want to take it back a little bit about the science and also how it can help practitioners as well, especially for the PhD research you did, because it has been a while already. I saw 2017, right?
Gosh.
Was that one of those research where you said, maybe I learned something about...
Yeah, so that was 2017, I think. Those were my undergrad papers. So I was very young and I was still learning the field. And even my collaborators, it was a lot of work we were doing we thought was really great. But new research came out that made us critique it. So I have been publishing in the field since I think 2016 may have been my earliest paper. I think we submitted it 2016 and it came out 2017, something like that. My PhD was 2022, I think. 220. Yeah, 222 seems about right. But like I said, there is a huge development in research. And I have just had a paper published now. Actually, this morning I got notified that I've got a research paper that's just been published. But just for an understanding, that paper was finished 3 years ago. That's how long it takes sometimes for paper to get within the system, because it is a very time-consuming system. For publications, you think that you can just submit a paper, it's done. There's a huge wait. There's a back and forth with editors. There's a back and forth with reviewers, and it can take many years. So sometimes by the time you get this new idea into the literature, it's old. So even science is catching up on itself sometimes. And again, it might seem like a terrible system, but there is no better system that we have, because I'm a reviewer myself. So when people submit papers, I review them for integrity, for their analysis, for literature review, everything like that. And I dive in, and then the other reviewer does the same. And then you give it back, so they do corrections. This has got to be the way that it is. And it does take time. But that's how we maintain integrity of research. And if we got rid of this and submitted papers quickly, we'd have so much rubbish out there.
For sure.
So it's not a perfect system, but it is the best that we have. And it's better to have a system like this than let rubbish papers slip through, because what's the point in a paper being published if it's not giving you something that's robust and effective and valid?
So help us understand, Abbie, because what I've read, your PhD was focused on using nonverbal communication to influence information elicitation. Can you take us a little bit through the conclusions you got, and maybe also think about how can practitioners use those conclusions in their everyday practice?
So I focused on nonverbal mimicry. So I looked at how we could use nonverbal communication to influence elicitation. But I wasn't just happy with that. I wanted to understand why something worked, because we knew that nonverbal mimicry, when implemented, can create cooperation. But understanding why it works, again, is that understanding what barriers is overcome. And obviously, they're very complicated in terms of the extraneous variables that we examined. So I don't have time to go into all of the details, but the synopsis really is, what I found was that mimicry of the upper body, say mimicry of the hands, which is what we often do, it wasn't as effective and it's too overt. So mimicry of the head and mimicry of the upper body collectively. So sometimes say you change your posture. I move my posture. Nod your head. I nod my head. That did have a significant effect. But mimicry of the lower body was the most effective. So you change your posture. Maybe you're sat and you cross your legs. I cross my legs. So mimicry, when done correctly, was able to increase the amount of information that people shared with you. So the other things I found was the timing is important. Mimicry, if you do it instantly after someone does it, it becomes too overt. So it has a reduced effect because people start to notice it. And if you do it too slowly after, it starts becoming mimicry and it just becomes you showing that behavior. So there was really this optimal window of 5 ± 2. So 3 to 7 seconds after a behavior is shown is that optimal window. I also found that when you observe people mimicking, so say I'm about to have a conversation with you and I see you having a conversation with someone else. If you two are mimicking each other, I have an increased trust towards you both. And I'm more likely to cooperate with you because I've observed mimicry. Now, this is all unconscious. But in terms of the psychological mechanism, what I found was the reason that mimicry is connected to increased cooperation is because it increases feelings of closeness to that person. Now, this is a key finding, because if you mimic, but that person being mimicked doesn't feel close, then that effect on cooperation is much smaller. Now, if you mimic me and I feel closer to you, the effect on cooperation is much higher. So what this tells me is nonverbals aren't enough. What I need to do is make sure that my questioning techniques are utilizing increased closeness. So ways that we can increase closeness, proximity, mutual self-disclosure, I can validate you, I can show active listening. All of these things, plus loads more, have been shown to increase interpersonal closeness.
Yeah.
And say I'm aggressive, or I don't validate you, or I interrupt, these things reduce closeness. So if I couple mimicry with ones that increase closeness, I have a greater effect on cooperation, because those techniques allow that mimicry to flourish, because it's a mediator. If I use mimicry and don't focus on that closeness, I'm going to have reduced cooperation. So that's why it's important to understand that psychology in between.
That's also when we talk about myths, right? Like being said, for instance, in neuro-linguistic programming, big people on stage is saying, if you start to drink, you should do the same thing. But when there is resistance in the conversation, the rapport and the connection is already broken.
Yes. Yeah,
So,
and absolutely. And if there is already tension in the conversation, what can happen is it has a reverse effect. So if you are in a positive interaction or a neutral interaction and you use mimicry, it has a positive outcome. If you are in a conflict or a very negative interaction and you utilize mimicry, it makes the interaction more negative. So again, this is why it's really important to understand the nuances, because just because something works in one context doesn't mean you can apply it to every context.
Exactly.
There are nuances.
And the same goes also with, and you see it often, people who are still thinking that if you say that you are seeing a certain nonverbal movement, like, I see you frowning, is there something wrong? Or what are you thinking about? That even saying the nonverbal makes people even more alert when there is resistance already. So they shut down, right?
Yeah.
But also based on NLP, you still see it. Yeah, you should be transparent. You should be honest on what you see, and you should let people know. But that only works also when the connection is already there. Is that the right perception?
Yeah, people don't like having a mirror held up to them. And I get this all the time, because as soon as people find out what I do, they find out, oh, you're an expert in behavior analysis. Tell me what I'm thinking then.
Yeah.
And I get that instantly. They go, okay, assess me then.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, it doesn't work that way. I'm not Sherlock Holmes. And then they go, no, tell me this. And then if you do give them an assessment, what people want is to prove you wrong. People are so resistant to being faced with their own behaviors. So they say, well, why am I thinking this? And you give them an analysis. They want to prove why they are right and you're wrong. And it is something we don't like to have a mirror held up to us. It's very human to resist against our own behavior. It is just very, very human. So when people ask me that, I'm like, no, I'm not going to.
Yeah.
Because what's the point? You know, they go, oh, no, show me. I won't. You know, what does this behavior say? And I'm like, it doesn't really matter if I tell you, because there's going to be so many biases now that get in the way. Like if you say to someone, I'm studying your nonverbal behavior, what's going to happen? Their nonverbals are going to become unnatural. So any effect to influence them or read them now is going to be biased, and it's going to be pointless. So saying, I see that you're smiling, or I see that you're frowning, I see this, all you do now is you kind of put a spotlight on them and you make them feel observed. It is uncomfortable to feel observed. Like if I put a camera in your house, even if it's not on, it makes you uncomfortable. Like we have shown that if you put a picture of a police officer or a picture of an eye in a shop, it reduces shoplifting because people feel observed. It's uncomfortable to feel like there are eyes on you and you don't act naturally. So if you know I'm assessing your nonverbals, I draw attention to it, the rest of the conversation now, you're going to be more uncomfortable. It isn't a helpful approach.
No, and that's why I actually developed my training method that you should all split up what you actually can observe. So nonverbal behavioral analysis is just observing, analyzing, and not so much interpreting, because you can only interpret when you have done the conversation, when you ask the questions, when you have the conversation. That's my pillar 2, right? So you have nonverbal analysis. Pillar 2 is having the conversation, and pillar 3 is for me nonverbal intelligence, like using the timing of the nonverbals and knowing when to act upon it, knowing how to influence the situation, knowing when someone else is doing or showing a nonverbal that it actually might be about your nonverbal impact.
Yes, I was just about to say that. Sometimes we see something, we go, oh, that's interesting, but it could be a response to what I'm doing. So maybe I see them change behavior and I go, but I'm unconsciously mimicking, or they're unconsciously mimicking me. Yeah. Or maybe I'm being too aggressive in my nonverbals. Maybe I'm leaning forward without realizing, and they lean back, or they lean forward. But it's a response to me, not necessarily what's going on in them objectively. And that's why when people say, oh, well, assess me right now, I say, you realize that to do a thorough nonverbal assessment, it takes about 15 minutes per minute on video. If you really want to do a thorough one, you think that I can do that in real time? If anyone says in real time, I notice all of these cues and I'm able to be a perfect interviewer, they're lying, because you have a limited cognitive capacity. You also have a limited eyesight.
Yeah.
So if I'm looking at your face, I can't see what your lower body is doing. If I'm looking at your hand, my peripheral vision can see other stuff, but my attention is focused elsewhere. So we are limited in our cognitive capacity and our literal eyesight. We don't notice everything. Having that video recording, going back and making improvements, that's where the magic happens.
Exactly. And that's why I often disagree. People ask me a lot of the time, and you should be more marketing focused. You should analyze all those people. And I do it often, but I always say there is a lot of research. I listen and I watch a lot of videos of that particular person before I even dare to say something about
There's
it.
A lot of prep.
But also being in the conversation, because here in the Netherlands you also have this show called Faking It, and then people start to talk about 𝗂𝗵𝗿𝗄, and then people start to say, yeah, he's shrugging the shoulders, or one eyebrow is going up. That means that he might not believe in himself. And then I'm like, okay, that's interesting, because he is saying it to a certain interviewer. What's the impact of the interviewer? You cannot see that in that particular image. So if you want to do a very good analysis, you should know what they are doing together, what the dynamics are. And that's why I often say, no, I'm not going to say anything about specific people in the media.
I get us to, analyze this picture, do this. And I say, no, because I'm not going to take your money, because I'm not going to be able to provide you a reliable assessment, because these parameters just don't work for me. And there's a lot of people that will take the money and won't do the job and won't do the assessment. But it leads to misleadings in the field, and it reduces people's trust in the field.
Yeah, very difficult also to be aware for most of the people, because in analysis we still believe we can assess people like that as well. And that's why I say you can use every method, and there is some truth in every method. Microexpressions, there is a lot of research, but also discredited research about, well, when we talk about 𝗵𝗵𝗁, she's very clear also about microexpression, and that it might be more about social construct, and also about people don't often understand the difference between emotional recognition and the production of emotions and how feelings work, right? Yeah. So I also say a lot of those methods are based on emotion recognition. What I, as an observer, recognize, it doesn't mean that the emotions or the feelings are actually there. And I also have this example of this. For instance, there is this red teaming kind of situation or scenario training where this agent suddenly came into a situation that was very overwhelming, because there was a group of people coming after her. And then they say, yeah, she was looking very angry, so very aggressive. So the only thing we felt we were going to do is just attack her before she attacks us. And then I was video analyzing the situation and I was showing it to her. This is your impact. You are showing anger. And then she said, but I was not angry. I felt powerless. And I was angry on myself, but the emotion was actually feeling powerless. So what we trained her in is actually how to be more congruent from the inside out. How can you convince yourself that you can overcome that powerless feeling? Or in the interaction, how can you interact with other people so that verbal and non-verbal become congruent, if you will? So what's your opinion on that?
No, I completely agree. We forget the role that we play in observation and analysis. And we think so much just about one side. We have to remember that there is both inside and outside with every interaction. And we have to try and take ourselves out of it at some point, but then put ourselves back into it at other points.
Yeah. So what would your advice be for practitioners as well, especially in these kinds of fields, because there is a lot of misinterpretation also about, we talked about this fight, flight, freeze system, for instance, where people still sometimes think that freeze is actually stiffening up. Well, that there is more information about that freeze is more about letting go of your muscle tone, lowering your heart rate, lowering your breath rate, that it lowers your muscle tone even. So it's not about stiffness, but more so drawing back from the situation so that you are able to,
Well, the freeze response only occurs in trauma. There's a lot of misunderstandings that the freeze response is something that occurs just in emotional interactions. Fight and flight do. But freeze response is specific to such high stress that it creates a traumatic emotional experience. So for most interactions, I would say the freeze response really isn't that important. Say you're just doing a normal interview. You don't need to know about the freeze response in the same way because there's no trauma occurring. But say it is a really high stress, like really high stress interaction, and you start to see rigidity, and you start to see shock, and you start to see like they're unable to speak as much. Because when you go into a freeze response, it can reduce activity in part of the brain called Broca's area, which is responsible for speech production. Your parasympathetic nervous system is activated instead of just a sympathetic, meaning heart rate reduces, muscle tone, and everything kind of relaxes. Your body goes into this state of almost extreme relaxation, and you freeze. So those, I wouldn't say, are as important for investigators to recognize. What you're mostly going to see is fight or flight response. So you're going to start to see behaviors of, say, flight. If we look at where the blood flow is in the body, when I'm in flight mode, the blood will get itself to my lower body because it's preparing to flee. So my legs need to be activated. So I'm going to start moving my lower body, things like that. And you might see discoloration in the face. If I'm in fight mode, the blood flow will go to my chest because my body is saying, okay, we need it to the muscle group that's going to fight. So you might start seeing things like clamping of the hands. You're going to start to see things like puffing up of the chest. You won't see that discoloration. You might see some clenching of the jaw, tightness in the muscle, things like that. But again, this is why my advice is don't get your information from TikTok. Don't get your information from
that's one
blogs. Use blogs and things like that to inspire curiosity. But go to the academics or scientific advisors or the research papers, because these concepts are complicated and very easy to misunderstand in big ways and small ways. So having someone who understands it in a really deep way, explain it, or go to the research papers yourself if that is something that you like to do, is a much better way than going to TikTok or quick learning.
Well, this is actually quite interesting. And we should maybe have a lot of discussions about this after the podcast or some other day, because there's also research, like I told you before, of the INSA method that say, well, actually in interaction, people tend to show low muscle tone, lowering the heart rate, relaxing the under eyelid as well.
But that is not necessarily a freeze response. That's just that activation of the parasympathetic nervous system.
Exactly.
So often what we see a misunderstanding of the freeze response is simply just homeostasis. So we have the autonomic nervous system, and say the sympathetic nervous system is overactive now. I'm in flight mode, I'm in fight mode. What naturally needs to happen is my parasympathetic nervous system now will kick in.
Yeah.
It will start to activate, and it might kind of over activate, but that isn't a freeze response. A freeze response is really high stress to the point that it's traumatic.
Yeah.
That's why we kind of keep the freeze response very separate, and we can have relaxation states without it being a freeze response.
Yeah.
So same as like people often put the fawn response as the fourth F.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it really isn't. It's because the fight, flight, and freeze, they're automatic, completely uncontrollable. The fawn response isn't automatic. It takes some cognitive power because I decide now, okay, what's best for my survival. It isn't my nervous system instantly doing it for me. That takes a psychological process in between. So it really is fight, flight, freeze as automatic instinctual responses, followed by, if I'm in freeze, often there's a fawn response afterwards, but it isn't an instant automatic response like the other three.
No. Well, indeed, like said, interesting, because we see all those lower muscle tones, and people also, they did self-observations as well, right? So they feel themselves drawing in and drawing back from the interaction. So the nuance is very interesting to have more discussion. And also what you say about fawn is also what I'm also trying to understand when it comes to the literature about affiliation and to tend and befriend, of Shelley Taylor, for instance, who said, yeah, it might be that there's not just fight or flight mode, but also affiliation, to tend or befriend, based on the smiling, basing on oxytocin. Are you familiar with that literature as well?
Yeah, it's been shown for a very, very long time that the fawn response is something that is very common in trauma survivors. And actually, I was just an expert witness in a case, and she was showing a lot of fawn behaviors, and they can appear very strange. You know, why would you appease your attacker? Why would you do these things? And it's like, well, it's a survival instinct, because if the brain says, if I fight or if I fight, I'm going to be killed. So I freeze, right? So we immobilize.
Yeah.
But say you can't get out of that situation now and you start to come to, what might be the only way to survive? Well, if I'm really nice to my attacker, if I befriend them, if I show, hey, I'm willing, hey, I'm kind, hey, love me, they're not going to hurt me. So we fawn, we appease them, we befriend them. It's a survival instinct, absolutely. It's just not an automatic nervous system response. But it's something that's been very, and this is what I mean about making science accessible. It is something that is very deeply understood for a very, very long time in the academic literature. But it doesn't always translate that. And then a lot of practitioners are like, wow, this is very new information. And it isn't. It's been shown hundreds of times in the literature.
Yeah.
But it's just not always translated.
No, and I've seen also the fawn or the affiliation, and the connection between smiling and trying to build relationship and still connecting with people in team building situation as well, in conflicts as well, where people say, why are you still laughing? Well, it's actually might be a stress response of, I want to give my opinion, but I dare not to, because or else I will lose the relationship, and this is not what I want. So people misinterpret the smile as well. So we also tend to train people in, don't forget to analyze the situation and to see in which context it's actually happening, because it might be that underneath that smiling there is another interaction need going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Like a lot of people who are very uncomfortable or awkward or feel fear, they'll smile, like laughing sometimes in uncomfortable situations. It really depends on the person. There are definitely nuances to it.
Yeah. super interesting. We could talk for hours about
Yes.
this, but I still
And
have
so
a
many
few.
more too.
What is the time you have left, Abbie?
I have a hard stop in 5 minutes.
Oh, interesting. Well, maybe we should do another episode then, because we haven't.
And I am always down to have a conversation with you.
Yeah, it's very interesting. We haven't talked about the personal side of things,
Yep.
although I think this is very interesting because there is a lot of information for investigative interviewers as well.
Yeah.
But also diving more into your book, Work in Progress, diving more into our own experiences and our own journey into self-reflection and how it might help other people as well would be a very interesting topic for people to learn about.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I published my book, Work in Progress, I had said I have a book coming out, and the federal agents I work with were like, yes, we're going to use this to train our agents. And I said, just wait, it's not in influence. And they were like, oh, so what is it in? And I said, well, it's in empowerment and shame. And there was kind of like I didn't expect that. But then the agent said, you know what? I'm still going to use that to train my agents because it's just as important, if not more important. And the response from the book has been so eye-opening of one of the skills that we need more than anything, but don't always have access to, is an understanding of emotional regulation and self-reflection. Because self-reflection isn't just sat down saying, how do I feel? There's skills to it, and that there's important understandings that we need. And when I wrote this book, I didn't expect it to have the effect that it did. And I think having those conversations in the spaces like the federal interviewing, it's not often had, but I think it's really necessary.
Yeah. Yeah, and also that's something I talk about in my TED Talk as well, is you can only read others if you can read yourself.
Yes.
Because in the conversation, you get so much noise based on your own impacts, based on your own emotional regulation. So I think it might be very interesting for people to hear how we actually learned how to regulate our emotions as well, and what we learned from it. So let's take that to another conversation then.
Absolutely. Already looking forward to it.
Yeah, me as well. Although there is something we always have to do in a conversation, that's what I teach investigative interviewers as well, is how to round up a good conversation and interview. It's also about feedback, asking feedback. So how was this conversation for you, Abbie?
It was great, and I always love talking to you.
Very good to hear. But being self-critical as well, also a very important question. How did you like my interview style, or are there things you think I can improve on?
I like that with you, it's just a conversation. We just go back and forth. I think you had sent some questions beforehand that I was thinking, gosh, this is going to feel scripted. We didn't ask any of them. It was just a nice conversation.
Yeah, good to hear, because that's something we all need to learn, right? So build a conversation and not questioning people and having the feeling that you really have a connection. I think we really did. So thank you also for being my guest. And like I said, I'm looking forward to see you again.
Thank you so much for having me.
Bye, Abbie.
So, that's a wrap for today's episode of Mastering Momentum with An Gaiser and Dr. Abbie Maroño. But listen, just hearing this information isn't enough. We have uncovered the real science behind self-awareness, influence and impact. But knowledge about action is actually useless. So now it's your move.
But at the end of the day, there is no alternative for hard work. Because if you go into a meeting, say you're going into a meeting with someone who's from a culture you've never associated with before, you could go into that meeting and just prepare your notes and your negotiation style. Or you could go the extra mile, which means more time to research that culture, research their traditions, research what does work and doesn't work for them. Now that's a lot of additional work, but it's going to make your negotiation more successful.
This podcast isn't just about theory. It's about helping you create real change. If something in today's episode made you think differently, don't keep it to yourself. Hit follow so you never miss an episode, share this with someone who needs it, and let's keep building momentum together. New episodes drop every month. I'll see you in the next one. Bye!